What we're going to cover, first of all, is the significance of the date of Christmas. And I think the first thing to start with probably is Saturnalia, isn't it? Which you know all about. But as a quick summary before Beau, who knows far more about it than I do, talks about it, Saturn was an agricultural deity who was said to have reigned over the world in the Golden Age, where humans enjoyed bountiful amounts of food, and there was a festival held for him because, of course, in the winter, this is around the sort of time of the winter solstice, isn't it? I think it was between the 21st and the 25th, wasn't it? That was normally the period. It was more or less just under a week, I think.
Saturnalia.
Yes.
Well, it's funny, they celebrated Saturnalia for centuries and centuries and centuries, and it changed and morphed over that time. And Roman holidays quite often were very long. It was usually at least a week. Sometimes it was longer. But just like our Christmas, it just gets celebrated differently over the centuries. So the way, for example, we celebrated Christmas in England in the, say, 15th century is quite different to how we do it today, right? So it'd be different in the 3rd century BC as opposed to the 3rd century AD. It's all Saturnalia, but it would have, So anyway, usually at least 4 or 5 days, but sometimes longer, sometimes like 9 days, Saturnalia. So it all depends.
Okay, so there are some interesting aspects to it. For example, there is the slave master reversal aspect of it, which
that's the most famous thing, isn't it?
Would you be able to give everyone a bit of a rundown of what that entails?
Oh, right, yeah. Well, again, without it being too much of a cop-out, it depends really when you were celebrating. But the classic thing is that there was a role reversal between the master and the slaves, because, of course, ancient Rome was a slave society. But it seems from the accounts, we've got various accounts, like people like Cicero or one of the Plinies left us accounts and things. It would depend in your individual household how much you lent into that. So in some households, they really did have some sort of role reversal. And in others, like for days on end, where the slaves could tell the masters sort of what to do. But it seems that usually, most of the time, you served the slaves a meal once. They sat down at your table and you brought them the food out, like maybe once, or on one of the days you did that, and that was it. So again, like our Christmas, different households lean into it more than others, right?
Of course, yeah.
So I think that was the case. We've got accounts from ancient Rome, sort of classical Rome, 1st century AD and things, BC, where there's people that are like a type of Scrooge. They really hate Saturnalia. They hate that everyone's getting drunk and having a good time, and it really annoys them.
Some things are timeless,
right? And others just are waiting all year round for Saturnalia. They can't wait. One of the big things about Saturnalia was gambling for some reason.
Yeah, I read about this when I was doing my research, that supposedly there was some form of social stigma attached to gambling in Roman society, probably similar to how there is now, really, or at least in a comparable way. And around Saturnalia, it was seen as a bit more permissible and acceptable to do this as, okay, this is your time where you can indulge in this vice. So I can imagine that some certain people would then take that as their opportunity to get it out of their system, so to speak, and do a bit of gambling.
Well, I think gambling was quite pervasive in the Roman world, whether it was frowned upon or not. Just like in America, in various points in American history, where gambling is outlawed, but it doesn't stop people gambling.
Of course not, yeah.
Gambling, like fighting or prostitution, there's always going to be people that are going to do it. It doesn't matter if you outlaw it. It's just one of those things that people will do it. It's as simple as that. So dice was a massive thing in Roman society. People loved playing dice, betting on dice, whether it was frowned upon or not. That was common. Anyway, it seems during Saturnalia, even kids played dice and bet on dice and things. But quite often, because it's very light-hearted, you would bet with nuts rather than real money. Just like when you play cards and you bet with matchsticks or pennies or something. It's not about really making loads of money or anything. It's about the fun of it for its own sake. So that's what it was like in Saturnalia. Quite often people in a month or two before Saturnalia would sort of hoard nuts for gambling,
Like squirrels.
Yeah, right, for playing games and gambling during Saturnalia. Yeah, so
Yeah, I find it really interesting. But the reason that I bring this up in the first place is that it seems to set the scene. Some have argued that Saturnalia set some of the traditions in place that we continue to this day, which, I mean, I find it less convincing than the argument that it's more winter solstice things, in that the time of year dictates the kind of things in which people get up to. Because when you're, say, living off the land, how you spend your time is dictated by the land itself, isn't it? And by time of year, the weather, the temperature, that sort of thing. And so the winter solstice, of course, is on the 21st of December, which represents the shortest day, as in the fewest hours of daylight. And this occurs when either of the Earth's poles reach their maximum tilt away from the sun, to be a bit more specific. It's also the point where the sun appears at its lowest point of elevation in the sky, which I imagine would have been the easiest way of identifying winter solstice in the past. So yes, it's particularly important in the Mesolithic and Neolithic times, and Stonehenge is a great example of a monument that's specifically been aligned so that the setting sun on the winter solstice is positioned in the avenues between the stones so that you can see it from the centre of the circle. And lots of ancient monuments are aligned in that way because it's a significant time. Just purely from a practical standpoint, as well as a religious one in many cases.
it's funny. I think a lot of people, associate Stonehenge with summer solstice. Loads of people, hippies usually, quite go to New Age folk, go to Stonehenge and have a big party, stroke rave, stroke celebration of some
summer means a lot more, doesn't it, to modern people?
It's a nicer evening,
yeah,
right? I mean, it's as simple as that. And it may well have been associated with summer solstice, but I think they now think that if anything, it may well have been set up for winter solstice celebrations, and that it was really built for winter solstice reasons. But there's loads of truly ancient prehistoric, or in prehistory, megalithic structures that are set up for all the different equinoxes and all sorts of things. So yeah, the idea in the ancient world, or in prehistory, that it really was a matter of life and death to be able to tell the seasons accurately. Mm-hmm. You know, in our modern world, if you're not a farmer, it doesn't really matter, does it? It doesn't really make any real difference whether you know exactly when summer solstice is going to be, when the autumn equinox is. Doesn't matter. But in their world, it really could be, or was, the difference between life and death, or could be.
Yeah, definitely. And I've actually got here in my notes that these sorts of monuments could be used as a guide as when best to make animals mate with one another, or sow crops, or things of that nature that are essential to their survival. So it's no small thing, this date, as it's a good benchmark for when you should be able to do things, a means of telling at what point in the season you're at. And it's quite often a European tradition, in fact, that it marks the last great feast before the more difficult winter months as well. And that's been a tradition in Europe for as long as we have records, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, even in Saturnalia, a lot of what it was based around was animal sacrifice, and then obviously feasting.
The animal sacrifice is particularly significant as well, because you want to sacrifice the animals to potentially eat them, because you don't want to feed them through the winter, because then they're going to be eating your food.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like a double whammy of good things. You have less mouths to feed, and you get to feast by sacrificing some animals at Christmas. Well, New Year or winter solstice, whatever you want to say.
There's also the fact that fermented beers and wines are usually ready for consumption by this point in the year as well. And so, particularly when you're cold, a bit of alcohol to warm you up alongside a feast. Well, you can see where some of these traditions come from already. a little bit just by the time of the year that it occurs, because we're obviously not as attached to the land as we used to be. And so the origin of these sorts of traditions of having a feast at this sort of time, particularly in the northern hemisphere where the seasons are particularly significant, well, it makes a lot of sense that it's at this specific time. And it's perfectly reasonable in my mind that people would have a final feast.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, this idea that goes back to, again, prehistory, that the shortest day of the year is connected with the death of the sun, if that makes any sense. That the sun, all throughout autumn and the first bit of winter, the sun, if you're going to personify it or treat it as a deity or a god or something like a living thing in some way, it's dying. All throughout autumn and winter, it's becoming less and less powerful, rising lower and lower in the sky, only being up for fewer and fewer hours. It's dying. But then on winter solstice, it reaches its lowest ebb, and from that day onwards, it's reborn. It's beginning to live again. It's coming back. Your world won't be dark forever. All these sorts of things.
So it's a point of optimism in a way, in the middle of something that would be very unpleasant, a winter when you're forced to live in a sort of more primitive way.
Winter solstice is the fact that the sun is going to be rejuvenated or come back to life or has been reborn or something, like anything along those lines. It's something to celebrate. It really is something to celebrate, is that, we are going to have another new year. I mean, I think that even in prehistory, they knew that the sun wasn't actually going to never come up again or anything like that, probably. But, the point is it is something to celebrate. And that you're over the worst of it, right? After winter solstice, the worst, at least in theory, is over, and you can start looking forward. It's something to be hopeful about.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why throughout nearly all cultures and civilizations have marked that. As soon as you're sophisticated enough to mark the seasons, to have paid close enough attention to the sky, and you realise you sort of know what's going on, you know what's going to happen. That's sort of a really, really obvious point in the year to celebrate or to feast. We've made it through the darkest days, and why don't we mark it and feast and drink?
Yeah, and I think that that's something that is still an aspect of the celebration to this day, isn't it, really? Be it, a religious celebration or not, that's something that even secular people who celebrate Christmas understand is important. It's certainly something that I bear in mind. But obviously, the most significant case for December 25th being the Christmas holiday is the argument that it was when Jesus was born, which is kind of the whole point of Christmas, isn't it? I mean, it's Christ's Mass. That's what the word means.
The bit in Full Metal Jacket. He's like, today is Jesus' birthday. Right, yeah. I mean, if you're a Christian...
I love that film so much.
If you're a Christian, yeah, it's the Mass of Christ. And so, obviously, that date was decided upon by humans, probably centuries after
I've got
Christ
an article here from history.com, which actually explains where they got the date from. It says... the article's just titled "Christ is Born?" ? The oldest existing record of a Christmas celebration is found in a Roman almanac, and tells of Christ's Nativity festival led by the Church of Rome in 333 AD. And it says, after the Roman Emperor Constantine I converted to Christianity in 312 and sanctioned Christianity, church leaders made efforts to appropriate winter solstice holidays and thereby achieve a more seamless conversion to Christianity for the emperor's subjects. In rationalising the celebration of Jesus' birthday in late December, the church leaders may have argued that since the world was allegedly created on the spring equinox or late March, so too would Jesus have been conceived by God on that date, and the Virgin Mary, pregnant with the Son of God, would hence have given birth to Jesus 9 months later on the winter solstice. From Rome, the Christ's Nativity celebration spread to the other Christian churches to the west and the east, and soon most Christians were celebrating Christ's birth on December 25th.
Right.
So that's at least their explanation, which seems reasonable enough to me. Obviously, we don't know for absolute certain.
As far as I understand, and I've looked into it a few times, done a bit of reading, is that we don't know exactly why or how they finally came up with the 25th. Because it is a bit odd, because it's not the solstice, is it? It's just not.
No,
Right.
It's 4 days afterwards, which seems... You would be able to pinpoint it, wouldn't you? Even if you were just out and about, you would be able to get a 4-day window just eyeballing it.
Right, yeah, quite possibly, yeah. But what I think's most interesting about it is that it was in the 300s AD that they decided that, which for me is, well, that's interesting because it's so long after when Jesus of Nazareth was supposed to have lived. In fact, it took the Roman emperor being a Christian before it was sort of canonised, for want of a better word, before that was sort of written in stone when Christmas Day will be. It was quite late, in a sense, in the story of Christianity. That's quite late on. I mean, it's hundreds of years afterwards.
Yeah, you would have presumed that had it emerged, within his lifetime maybe, or at least shortly after his death, then it would be a bit more accurate. But the fact that that amount of time has passed seems to cast a bit of doubt on whether the date is truly the date of his birth. Yeah. But I suppose if you're looking at it from a religious standpoint, it's not necessarily that important whether it's the correct day. It's the act of the veneration itself, right, isn't it?
Sure. It just is interesting that it's not mentioned in the Gospels, is it? Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John don't mention the date when the baby Jesus was supposed to have been born. So again, it's just interesting that it took until the age of Constantine before they decided when it would be, because they also decided when Easter would be. And it's a funny date, isn't it, Easter? It falls on different days, even to this day. And it had to be decided upon by men, by bishops.
I wouldn't want that job, to be honest. It's not exactly an easy one, is it?
Right, yeah, well, it's contentious, isn't it? I think it is the case that different denominations of Christians to this day celebrate Easter at slightly different times. And Christmas, isn't it? Don't the Eastern Orthodox celebrate it at so slightly different time? I can't...
My understanding of that, this might be wrong, by the way, so sorry if it is that they were going off of the Russian calendar, which is slightly different.
Right, there is that. Yeah.
But that could also just be me misunderstanding it, because weren't they going off of the Julian calendar rather than the Gregorian one, I think, to be a bit more specific.
Right.
I think that because, of course, when you look at Russian history, quite often the dates are quite complicated. You get two sets of dates. You have the ones in which the Russians actually abided by, which would be the Julian calendar, and then you have the Gregorian one, which is the one that we use. Obviously, they changed it in Soviet times, but...
Yeah, that's why the October Revolution is sometimes in November.
Yeah.
Things, because of exactly that, yeah.
I still call it the November Revolution, yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
I still don't know which one's which, though, between the two. Isn't it that the Julian calendar's a bit behind the Gregorian one, or is it vice versa? I can't remember.
I saw something just the other day where in Red Square in Moscow they had up October 1917.
Ah. So I'm guessing that would be the modern date, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it would have to be. Yeah, it would have to be, yeah.
So it must be. I've just been saying it wrong. I've been going by the old calendar.
Because we switched over to the Gregorian, Britain and I think most of Western Europe switched over much, much earlier in the age of Newton. So what, the 17th century or something? So, yeah, we made that switch hundreds of years before they did.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a story as old as time, isn't it? That Russia's a little bit behind on the rest of Europe. I mean, that sounds a little bit condescending, but it's true that technologically speaking, quite often they would be a couple of hundred years behind the rest of Europe. And I think it took a lot of effort from Russian leaders, as I think I covered in the Contemplations, looking at Russian history, actually trying to force Russia to be more European for it to update and modernise a bit more.
Didn't they only get a McDonald's in 1990?
Well, you're just selling, not following
Yeah,
modernity.
I
now,
am
aren't you?
mucking about. They only got Yankee blue jeans last year. No, that is obviously... Sorry, carry on.
I was going to say they only got Metallica in 1991. But it's that famous concert.
Yeah.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.